Hello and welcome back to Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems podcast, where we talk to authors about writing, publishing, marketing, and all sorts of questions to do with the business that we're in. I am very excited to be here today, joined by Craig Touch, the author and founder of Hidden Gems, and two very special guests, because we're going to be discussing audiobooks today. We have Sarah Goer. Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Sarah. I'm a narrator and audiobook producer. As a producer, I've worked with award-winning indie authors, and as a narrator, I've worked both with indie authors and with major publishers like Scholastic, Penguin Random House, and Harbor.
That's awesome. And Karen White is also an audiobook narrator, producer, and author. Karen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Karen White. I have been narrating audiobooks since 1999, since they were on cassettes, which is a really long time. And actually, I've been winding down that work and pivoting toward both producing other authors' work, as well as helping them market their audiobooks. And finally, I published my first novel in 2020 under the pen name Karen Grey, Grey, because there was already a Karen White writer out there. So my daughter suggested Karen Beige, but I didn't think that was quite the right branding, so I went with Grey.
It's like the reverse of Lord of the Rings, where it goes from white to grey to white, and now it's white to grey.
Yes.
So my name is Ronan. I'm an author, and I do marketing work with some of the authors who work with Hidden Gems. But I'm going to pass it over now to Craig Touch to introduce himself. Craig, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Roland. I mean, I don't think I'm going to introduce myself again because we did that in the first podcast, and I'd rather just get right back into it. Everyone knows I run Hidden Gems. That's all we need to know. I used to write. But I think, audiobooks is one of the topics that we really wanted to talk about. I thought it was really important to talk about that sooner rather than later, because the whole market has really been growing recently. And I think, back when you and I, Roland, when we were self-publishing, I think it definitely was a lot. It was more niche, let's say, right? But now it's like, there's been recent acquisitions in the space, consolidations. Spotify is getting into it. They purchased Findaway. Swedish audiobook company Storytel bought audiobooks.com as a way to get into the US market. So, I mean, there's a lot of change and opportunity for authors now. So, I think it's important that we look at that kind of thing, right? Because when you and I started doing this, and that was 7 or 8 years ago now, I didn't know of very many authors that had audiobooks. I think it was pretty rare at that time, and it never seemed like it would be worth the time and the money to pursue the format. I didn't even actually know anybody that listened to them. I wasn't really hearing from authors saying that they're making a lot of money with them. It just seemed like another format, something else to experiment with. The industry grew, and I ended up sort of converting one of my own series to the format. But even then, it was completely by chance. It was I was contacted by a company that basically just offered to buy the audiobook rights for one of my series, and they did everything for me. And then in return, they offered to pay me in advance, and then royalties, which first would go towards paying the advance back, and then if it became more, I could earn more. Just, I think, standard, and we'll talk about that. But it seemed like a no-brainer at the time, so I jumped at that. I wasn't planning on doing audiobooks on my own, so it was kind of free money. But as it turns out, at the time, I had already started Hidden Gems, and it was taking more and more of my time. And shortly after making that audiobook deal, I kind of stopped publishing new stuff in general, stopped advertising, stopped marketing. And I'm sure that's not what the company that bought the rights was banking on. At the time I was writing, up until then, I'd been writing a lot of books, publishing a lot under the pen name. And I assume they thought I was going to continue doing that. And, I didn't know that I wasn't necessarily at that time. But, I think it would have been much more lucrative for both of us if I had continued during that, right? Because, if I'm not advertising, nobody's advertising it, right? So Anyways, that's my experience with audiobooks, and obviously it's very limited, so that's why we invited these two much more knowledgeable people to talk us through all of it. I'm sure a lot of authors these days are seeing a lot of this and wondering, like we were, whether they should get into it. And I guess that's really where it all starts. The question of whether or not they should even try to get into audiobooks, never mind how to actually do it, which is also what we'll dig into. But first they have to decide, should they do it? And because the answer is not yes for everyone, right? But the question is, what are the factors that the authors need to make that decision? And I think that's where we should start this whole discussion. So I don't know, Sarah, do you want to kick that off?
I would love to, yeah. So first of all, I'm going to be making the presumption that we're talking about authors making a financial business decision, right? Because there's a whole alternate path where somebody's like, I don't care how much it costs or if I make my profit back, I just feel passionate about having an audiobook. That's a different, line of thought. So if we're presuming that we're looking for a good financial return, there's a really, it's good to know that for most authors, unless you're like a crazy bestseller, audiobooks do tend to be more of a long game. You tend to recoup over more like, 1 to 3 years, and then it's pure profit after that. And then also it can be good for authors who write in series, because bundles are very lucrative in audio, because a lot of the audio distribution platforms, or storefronts rather, a listener can pay 1 credit and get the bundle, and listeners love using their credit on multiple books instead of one. And I've had authors, for example, they were in the long game and their first single audiobooks were doing well and on their way, and then they published the bundle and all of a sudden made bank. So those are 2 considerations: is, are you comfortable with a long game? Are you comfortable with, or are you in series writing bundles? And then author Liv Brywood came up with this great rule of thumb that I love to share, because I think it's really handy. And again, every author's different, every book is different. There are no guarantees, but a really rough rule of thumb is that if your ebook covers the cost of audio production within the first month of the ebook sales, then the audiobook is a pretty darn good financial bet for you.
I think that is one that I didn't know Liv had come up with it. And actually, I heard it from you, but I've also heard it from other sources. So I think it's a really good baseline to start from. And then the other big decision you have is the one that Craig started talking about, which is, if you're an indie author or a traditionally published author, do you publish yourself? Or do you seek or accept an offer from a dedicated audiobook publisher? So I think a lot of people don't understand that there are companies who do not publish in print, like Penguin Random House or Harper does, but all they do is publish audiobooks. There's Tantor Audio, there's Brilliance Audio, there's Blackstone Audio, even Audible is a dedicated audiobook publisher. And what they must do is purchase rights from authors in order to publish their content. And just like deciding whether to go the traditional route or the hybrid route or the indie route as an author, it's a similar kind of decision with an added element of risk, in that you're going to have to spend a lot more, but you can earn a lot more. And again, I think Sarah's point about the long game is really appropriate. I know authors who have who have sold their rights to an audiobook publisher and been ecstatic about it. And I've known ones who have felt like, oh, I wish I hadn't done that, because I'm doing all the marketing work, which happens, with whether you're traditionally published or not in ebook or audiobook. You're going to do some marketing work. You have to. I'm doing all that work, and yet I'm having to share my royalties with this, depending on whether you have an agent, whether you were traditionally published originally and they sold the rights to an audiobook publisher, you are sharing those royalties with an ever widening group of entities. So I see often, once authors established or authors with a long backlist get into audiobooks, even if they started sharing their royalties, they often, if it's a successful situation, if their books are selling, they shift over to doing it all themselves, publishing it all themselves. Then the next set of decisions you have to make is how you're going to get that audiobook made. And that's when we step into how to produce an audiobook. But Craig, does that make sense? Do you have any other questions about that decision-making process or how it happens?
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I think the rule of thumb, how much you're making in a month on your ebook and whether that covers the cost, I think that's definitely makes the decision easy if that's something that is sort of like accepted as an industry standard, whether Liv came up with it, and but if everyone agrees that that's like a good metric, then that's a good metric, right? It's interesting too because you're talking about the idea of author, and I get the long game for sure. Like I've seen the numbers on my own stuff and how even if I was still publishing, I'm sure like the numbers are still going to be small, and it would have taken time to get that money back. And how authors have to understand that they're only going to get that small portion. And I think the interesting thing with self-publishing is a lot of authors actually got into it because they don't like all those fingers in their pie. They don't want to give to their agent and give to their publisher and give to their manager and give to they want to keep it to themselves, and they say self-publish and they get their percentage, their higher percentage, much higher percentage from Amazon, right? But then if you go the audiobook route and you sell your rights, you're back in that game where you're now only getting a tiny little portion of the money. And I think to start, maybe that's a good way to go for some people. They might have their regrets about it, but as long as maybe a good idea is don't sell all of them, just sell one, try it out, see how it goes, and then move from there. And then I also wonder whether or not when you make those deals, are they always in perpetuity? I assume they probably are because they're putting up that sort of initial cost, but can you ever make a deal where the rights would revert back to you at some point? But I guess the difficulty there is that upfront cost that they would have paid all the narrators for and the production and all that stuff.
They actually tend to be licensed for 7 to 10 years, actually. So usually the rights will eventually revert back to you, but you won't have the rights to the audiobook that got made. So if you want to then go publish your own, you're still going to have to pay for an audiobook. But I want to make a really key point about selling your rights that I think, building on what Karen was saying, that I feel really passionately about this because I think a lot of indie authors do not understand this. And they think they have a false notion that either they sell their rights, they make fewer royalties, but they don't have to put in the labor and effort, or they keep their rights, but they have to put in all the labor and effort to manage their own audio. And there's two things I feel really strongly about every author understanding so they can really make an informed decision. And the first is when you get an offer from an audio publisher, understanding what the numbers they give you mean. Because when they say, hey, we're going to pay you 25% royalties, they do not mean 25% royalties of the gross sales. They mean 25% of what they take in. And the reason that is so key to understand, and I know Karen actually has some great resources on her website, and she talks about this, is that you're then getting a percent of a percent. So for example, let's say the company says, oh, I'm going to pay you 25% royalties. Well, we don't know what any particular company's deal with Audible is, but we do know the industry standard is about 35 to 40% that they're taking in from Audible. And what that means is when they say 25%, they really mean 25% of 35 to 40%, which actually equals 8.8 to 10%. And I think a lot of authors, when they're getting that offer, they don't understand that what you need to be comparing is that, 8.8 to 10% from Audible versus if you went direct and you were exclusive to Audible and Amazon, you'd be making 40%. Or if you decide to go non-exclusive so you can distribute wide, you'd be making 25%. So that's one really, really key factor that I want to make sure I'm so passionate that every author understands so they're really making an informed decision.
And
And
can I also say that
please do.
when Craig was talking about maybe you try one book, if you're going to go that route, the problem is if you, and I've heard from authors who have done this and regretted it, if you do the first book in the series, unfortunately, that's usually the book you want to advertise, the book that you want to use to market the rest of the series. So then you're having to market a book that you're sharing the royalties on. Also, that's usually the biggest seller in the series overall. So I think that would be an iffy choice for me um, if you think you might want to go the indie route. If you're already an indie author, I think I know what Sarah's going to say next, and I think that my advice often is to wait until you have the resources to fund your own audiobooks, and then get help from an audiobook production company, which both
Exactly.
Sarah and I work with. And there's a lot of different reasons why you want to do that. But the main one is that we are a strong, close-knit community. We look out for each other. We help each other. We know who's good to work with and who's not so reliable. And we trust each other in terms of getting paid, perhaps more than we would an author that we never heard of. So, but I think Sarah probably wants to say more on that, so I'll let her do that.
Oh no, you're already heading there. But that's the next point I wanted to make, is that I think a lot of authors don't understand. They think, well, I know I'd make more money if I didn't sell my rights, but I just do not have the bandwidth. I don't want to manage audio. And what they don't understand is there's a different option. That option is called hire a producer. So someone like me or someone like Karen, or there are many other producers out there, you can Google them. They will just take it off your plate and do all the work for you for a flat fee rather than a royalty share. And so if you are, that's what I'm always telling authors, like if you're in a, selling your rights is fantastic if you're like, look, I do not want to take any financial risk on this. I want an advance, and I'm comfortable giving up a % of my royalties in exchange for that. Great option then. But if you're in a position where you're like, look, I know I'd make more, but I just don't have the bandwidth to manage audio, but I can totally afford to pay for it. I just can't, I just don't want to deal with it. I'm too busy writing my books. Please hire a producer, because that will solve your problem and you can keep all your royalties. And then, of course, there's the third option of managing your own audio, which, as Karen just pointed out, there are challenges to that. But we can give you lots of tips today, too, about like why you might want to go that path instead of hiring a producer, and ways to help smooth that path and make it easier for you if you're going to head that direction.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so I definitely agree with what Karen was saying. I mean, I would never, if I was going to try and test it out with the market, with selling my rights, I would never sell part of a series. It would always be a standalone book as sort of a test, right? But no, I think it sounds like to me there's like sort of 3 levels then, right? There's the completely sell your rights and just take in the money and be okay with this, that small % of a %. Then there's the other extreme, which is do everything yourself. So that's you've got the book, you've got to go and find the narrators, hire them, do a casting call. I don't know how you do it. You got to record it, or maybe they record it. I don't know. You have to edit it. You have to do all sorts of things, right? And then there's that middle ground, which is what sounds like would be probably a better option for most people, which is hire the producer, and then the producer takes, so you're putting out the money, but you're also getting the full % back. You don't have to do the work, but you have to, put some cash out there. And so I think that sort of middle ground probably works best for probably most cases, I would think. Certainly, once you've decided, at least that you've decided that you want to go the audiobook route, and you don't want to pay, you don't want to sell off your rights, right? I think that, doing it yourself, I think your money that you would spend to have a producer do it, and the time, it's actually even more the time, is better spent writing your next book than having to become an expert at all the things that you need to become an expert at to create a good audiobook, right?
And one of the things I think author Lauren Blakely is a really good example of this. She, before she began publishing in audio, and she is someone who has really been a leader in trying out new things in audio, and especially in the multicast realm. She, before she started publishing in audio, was a huge audiobook fan and still is. So she's already got in her ears, she knows who the popular narrators are. She knows who's particularly good in her subgenres of romance. Unless you are there, or your best friend or your PA or your husband or someone close in your circle is enmeshed in the audiobook world, and that they know the hot new narrators, or they know, even more importantly, the up and coming narrators. They know what is important to listen for in an audiobook production, on the production level, as well as the performance. What's important in the different genres, because every genre has listeners that expect certain things. Unless you or someone who is again close to you knows those things, then, and I didn't used to say this. I've been presenting books on publishing in audio to authors for about 10 years now, and I didn't used to think that going the producer route was worth it, but things change so fast now, and trends change, who's hot changes, but also there's so many decisions to be made now because of the explosion, especially of wide distributors. To me now, it is worth the very small percentage that most producers charge. They'll get you often a narrator at a lower rate. They'll get you a narrator at a better schedule. They can help you in so many different ways that now I do recommend it. As long as you find one that, an author friend recommends. I wouldn't necessarily just Google them, because who knows what you could get some AI narrator that you didn't realize. But I would definitely go with friends' recommendations, or other, people that you find through other resources.
Could I ask a very stupid question, which I think is probably one of the reasons I'm here? You speak about, there's a good rule of thumb is, what if your first month of a release can pay for the audiobook production? That's a good rule of thumb. What kind of figure are we talking there? I mean, one of my successful books might make like $7,000 in its first month. Is that kind of the figure we're talking about, to hire a producer and just be like, can you do it for me?
It depends on the length of the audio, because that's how it's billed, right? So if it's a 15-hour book, that's going to be a significantly different cost than if it's a 6 to 7 hour book. But I'm going to say 7,000 for most authors would absolutely cover an audio production, whether you're working with a producer or going directly to narrators. Would you agree with that, Karen?
Yeah. And I have on my website some resources. It's either KarenWhiteAudiobooks.com or KarenGray.com or HomeCookBooks.com, but then you go to the resources tab, and I have actually a vocabulary list for audiobooks, and on it is PFH, which I'm not quite sure how this got started, but since I started in 1999, and I know before, for whatever reason, everyone in audiobooks is paid by what's called the finished hour, per finished hour. That's PFH. So no matter how long it takes me sitting in this little booth, you guys can see, and Sarah's in hers too, to record a finished hour of audiobooks, no matter how long if it takes me 3 hours or an hour and a half or 5 hours, I get paid per finished hour. So does the editor, so does the proofer, so does the producer. So your estimate that you will get when you talk to a producer or a narrator who's going to produce for you. Often narrators will do this for you if you're just working with a single narrator and you found the right voice, and we can talk about how you might do that. They can quote you a per finished hour rate, which is going to be an estimate, because we are human beings, we are acting. There is a formula I think this is also on my website, where you can, it can be calculated by the word length, not the page length, obviously, because as we all know, my page is different than your page, how many words fit on it. So you take the word length, you divide it by 9,300, and that will give you a good estimate for how long your book will be when it's done. Now, how much a book can cost per finished hour, there is a really wide range. And usually that depends upon the experience level of your narrator and the demand of your narrator. There's kind of a gate you don't want to go below, because then you're almost definitely getting someone who is just trying this out, and you don't want to be their proving ground. And then, you can go into the stratosphere on, in terms of, you want to hire Meryl Streep, you could, I don't even know what she charges, but I'm sure it's in the thousands per finished hour, but she's really good. Brad Pitt, on the other hand, is terrible. So and even a celebrity is not going to guarantee a great audiobook performance.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good point, right? Is when you were saying like your month, your month's income is if the cost is going to be less than that, then it's a good deal, right? Everyone's month is different, but it also doesn't mean that you have to spend that entire budget on it. It just means if it's that or lower, right? So if your book's making $7,000 in a month, doesn't mean go spend $7,000. It just means don't spend more than $7,000.
Exactly. Yeah. There's no need to overspend if you've got a quality audiobook that costs you less.
And I think the point of that number is to say that if your ebook sales are at that level, then it is highly likely that your audiobook sales are going to do well. There's like a Venn diagram of readers. There's readers who read with their eyes and readers who read with their ears. And then there's this weird middle ground of people who do both. And I think that's how that number was arrived at, was just looking at trends, looking at how people are consuming books. And as Craig talked about at the very beginning, if you look at the numbers that the Audiobook Publishers Association puts out in their annual report, audiobooks have had double-digit growth in the past 8 years, year upon year upon year, all the while that print, adult fiction, adult books in all categories in print are going down and down and down, or doing wild things. Audiobooks just keep going up, and for better or for worse, the pandemic, I think, has not slowed that down. People need an escape, and technology has made it easy for us to listen, doing gardening, doing not just driving in the car. Everyone thought, oh God, no one's going to listen to audiobooks because they're not commuting anymore. Well, they're still listening. Sometimes it's on their couch. And that's another part of this big report that they put out, is what people are doing while they're listening. Sometimes it's nothing, but often it's cooking, cleaning, just doing all the chores. And I think it's like I said before, we need the escape. So an audiobook, for many people, not for all, it's like a bigger escape, because it's involving it's using a different sense than your eyes, and the actor's doing a lot of work for you, so they are creating an experience and feeling the feelings that help you go on the emotional journey of the book. So I don't know why I started talking about this, but I guess I can circle back to cost with this argument, which is you get what you pay for. And I think when you are looking for a narrator, and maybe we're going to switch over to this, you definitely want to find somebody who knows what they're doing. And a lot of authors think, well, I read, I read to my kids. I like to read books. Maybe I should do it. Um, this is a profession. It's most people who do this are classically trained actors, or have worked in other voice acting realms. But we all do a lot of training to get to this point where our voices are fully available to our imaginations, so that we can bring your words to life. And that's what you're paying for. As well as with all the equipment that we have to have to both record and mix and master your books. So it's what you're paying for is a lot of different skill sets, and often a lot of even different people. I mentioned proofing, editing, mastering, casting. I mean, there's a lot of different actions that go into creating an audiobook. I mean, we could talk about this for hours and hours, Craig. So what do you want to know about? No, I'll shut up.
Well, I mean, I think you make a good point, and I think we talk about this on the blog a lot. Is just because you can do something on your own doesn't mean that you should, and it doesn't mean that it's necessarily the best choice for your book, right? Like when I started, I did my own covers. I'm not a cover designer. I'm not. I know how. I mean, I know somewhat how. I can take a stock image and I can put a title on it, but I don't know how to blend it all together. I don't know how to use the elements of light and color and this and that, right? And when I switched to paying for covers, I did better, right? And it's not. I mean, the books didn't change really. It's a better cover, and I've said this to authors all the time when I talk to them. Is they ask about why their book isn't doing well, and I'll look at it, and one of the first things I'll say is, I mean, your cover, it looks like you did it yourself, and people don't necessarily want to see that. And it's the same thing it sounds like with audiobooks. Just because I can talk doesn't mean that I should narrate my own book, right? So I think hiring the narrators, you probably have to go through a process. If you're doing it yourself, you have to interview them, maybe hear what they did. In my experience, with the company that hired me or that bought my rights, they gave me some options. They said, here's this person, here's that person. I could listen to samples, and then I could just pick. And I mean, I was pretty easygoing. I just took whatever they suggested. But some people have a very specific idea in their head of what it should sound like, what their hero and heroine should sound like. So yeah, we can talk about picking a narrator, but I think we should also talk briefly, at least, about we're talking about these costs. I'd like to maybe drill in a little bit to sort of what some of these costs are, and in general. I know obviously it's not going to be specific, but what kind of costs an author would be looking at if they were to hire or to hire a company or a producer, at least, to do it for them, or versus what they would pay for themselves, other than time, which is obviously going to be one of those costs, those hidden costs that people don't really think about, but should. So.
It's tricky to quote actual numbers, partly because of antitrust suits that have happened in the publishing industry. Whenever I do one of these workshops with the head of the Audiobook Publishers Association, and she's always said, don't ever quote rates. You can get sued for that. You can get in big trouble. But what I can do is point to, on ACX, there is a union minimum. So it's the amount for a full production that you can expect to pay. What I'll say is that minimum is extremely low for an experienced narrator for a full production. Often that minimum is what you're paid for just the narrator's performance. The other costs that you need to take into account are the edit, which may or may not include a proofing listen. And what that is when once the book has been recorded, then someone called the proofer sits with your text and listens to what the narrator has recorded. When I started, we actually had in the booth an engineer and a director, and I got to just act on the.
You must have had a larger booth.
Well, no. Well, yes, you're right. So there was this part of the booth where the narrator sat just with a microphone and like a desk and water. Now I have the microphone, I have a keypad, I have a monitor, but outside is a computer. In a professional studio where I started, it would be me with a microphone and a desk. Outside would be all the engineering equipment, all the recording equipment, and 2 humans. One who was watching all the lights go up and down. My husband's a sound engineer, and I don't understand what it all is because he does that for me. And then and doing the knobs. And the other person, the director, would sit there with the script and watch it as I recorded. And if I made a mistake, they would stop me. Well, because of technology and because of cost shrinkage, or the desire to shrink costs, most of us now do all of those 3 jobs by ourselves. So we are human, and it is likely we will make mistakes. So the proofer has always been a part of the process, but now they're really important. So they listen and go through the script, and whenever I make a mistake, they mark that, they create a spreadsheet of that. Then I do what's called corrections, and I re-record all the mistakes that I made. Those then get edited back into the original recording, and then mastering happens, which is this magical process that, again, I don't understand, but that it makes it all sound even and good, and also ready to be uploaded to all the various distributors. So you're paying for those things, as well as if you're paying a producer to cast the book, to schedule a book, to make sure things are happening on time, which is the herding cats part of it. Did I forget anything, Sarah?
No, that was a great summary. And the only thing I'd add is I completely agree with what you said about why it's tricky to quote exact rates. And so I'll just offer, and I imagine you would be open to this too. If anyone listening is like, yeah, but like quote me a rate for my book, email one of us and we will tell you our rates. And then you can email other people and ask them their rates and you can compare quotes.
Yeah, I think it's important too to hear all of the things that go into it, because those are all the things that you're going to be paying for, right? You're not just paying for somebody to pick up your book and read it out loud, right?
Exactly right. Yeah. And that goes back to the other reason. If authors who want to record their own books, I want to ask them why. Because if it's only a money saver, you have no idea the time and effort that goes in. Don't waste your time. Keep writing books. You're going to make more money that way. Like keep making money with your books until you're very comfortable affording audiobooks. The only case in which I would recommend authors read their own books is that they are very, very passionate about performing their own book, in which case maybe all that effort is worth it to you, but understand that it's probably not the best financial choice because you're going to make more money spending that time writing instead of the giant audiobook learning curve and then ending up with a product that may or may not be up to professional standards.
And that is an important thing. You can get the whole thing done, what you think is done, and then try to upload it to ACX or Findaway or whatever distributor you're using, and they will reject it if it is not up to their standards. But even worse, listeners are very discerning. And if there are strange noises, if there are uneven volumes, if there so many things can go wrong, they will, I'm sure authors, what happens if there's typos in your book, the reviews that you get for that kind of thing. It's very similar for audiobooks. People have very high expectations. So you have to be prepared to meet them. The only authors that I know that are successful in recording their books, fiction, are people who are also actors or who studied acting in college. The other obvious one are people who are writing a memoir and who already have a platform. So someone like, I can't think. Well, Brene Brown. I recorded one of her books, and they actually went back because she didn't have time. And the reviews were mixed because they were like, she's not Brene. I'm used to hearing Brene in TED Talks. I went Brene. So they went back and re-recorded the book about 5 years later because that's what people expected. That's the situation, I think, where it makes sense for the author to do it. But then usually that's Penguin Random House, and they're in charge of the whole thing anyway. So
I listened to the audiobook of Arnold Schwarzenegger's biography, and he narrated the first chapter, and then after the first chapter, you can understand why they brought in someone else to narrate the rest of the book.
Right, exactly. But if you are in a position like maybe you you have your own nonfiction platform and you're not at Brene Brown level, but you have a large audience and they're used to hearing you, go hire a professional studio that is specifically used to working with authors doing author reads, because that's actually, there are producers who specialize. They're like, oh yeah, I do that all the time. I'm really good at getting the best out of the author when they're reading their own book. So go find them. And I don't have a ton of resources for you, but one place you could start is Deyan Audio. It's Deyan Audio. They're very well known in the industry, and they have, plenty of experience setting up authors to do their own reads and connecting them with directors. So if you're in that position, go pay for it and do that, I would say.
Yeah, and I mean, we're going to put all these links in the description, so people don't have to worry about if they miss that. But I think that makes a good point. That something that people in general, not just authors, but people in general, have to realize is figuring out what your time is worth. And if you know that you can make X amount of money writing a book, and it takes you this amount of time to write the book, you can calculate out sort of your hourly rate. And then you think about how much time it's going to take you to record an audiobook, and whether or not, that makes sense for that to be where you're spending your time, especially if you're going to end up with a product that is, not the quality that people are expecting. And I think that was another good point, because we see that with self-publishing in general, is there is still sometimes a perception that a self-published book will be lower quality, right? And so some people don't want to read it because it's not by a publisher, it's not by a big name or whatever. And that's not necessarily true. It's not true for a lot of cases, right? But what doesn't help the situation is when the authors don't put the time in to make their book look and feel like it's a professional thing. Even if you did it yourself, if you have a professional cover and you paid for editing and you have a strong blurb and you do all those things, people won't even know whether it's professionally published or not. But when your book is full of typos and stuff, and the cover looks like it was done by your 5-year-old, then it looks like, people are, first of all, they're going to pass it by, but even if they give it a chance and they see all those errors, they're going to be like, yeah, this is why I don't do self-publishing. And it just gives the whole industry a bad name, and it doesn't help you. You won't make another sale from that person, even if your book is great.
I think I'd like to make a little change in your vocabulary there of because I agree with what you're saying, but
Sure.
Instead of saying your indie published book is not professionally published, I like to think of it as it's not traditionally published. And that's the same in audiobooks. Whether you're an indie author or a hybrid or a traditionally published author, in audiobooks, you want it to be professionally published. Again, because the expectations are so high for the listeners. And another point to think about in terms of choosing your narrator, sort of leaping or jumping over to a side topic or connecting over to this, is that, and a lot of people I think don't think about this, is that your narrator becomes a whole other marketing tool for you. Many, many listeners will listen to a new author because they love the narrator. That is documented in study after study, that they will even jump genres because they love the narrator. So to me, one of the tricks of casting is to find somebody, and I said this a little bit earlier, who is just starting to crest that wave of popularity, of experience, especially in a genre. But again, people sometimes it's, for instance, my next book, and I haven't announced the narrators yet, so I can't say it, but the male is someone who has done really well in the fantasy genre, but has just started in romance. So he's not as expensive and not quite as busy as some of the tip-top male narrators, but he's really good. So what I do, and this is another thing to think about, is whether you're going to hire one narrator or two or more, which is a whole new trend that you do have to pay attention to. I tend to choose one narrator that has a little bit more of a name, and then another one with a slightly less of a name, because I can get them for cheaper often, or it's easier to schedule them because they're not so booked up. And then, I get two audiences. Both, their listeners may come to me, but also the one who's a little bit lower in the audience's mind then kind of gets lifted up. So that's another thing I think to think about when you're either working with a producer or a publisher or yourself, is finding the narrator that not only sounds good to you, and I think my advice is don't get stuck on, you had this, Robert Redford is this character in your head and you knew exactly what he needed to sound like. You're never going to find that person. Ever. I mean, you're just never going to match the voice in your head. Instead, you want to think about, does their style match the tone of my book? Does their pacing work for my book? Are their instincts, do they seem to take my book and my words and just bring them to life right away because they're connecting with it? All of those things are more important than what it sounded like in your head, because again, that is impossible to match. Beyond that, I think the most important thing in choosing a narrator is it's a marketing decision that you can exploit in many different ways.
Yeah, I wonder, do the narrators promote the works that they've done in social media to their own followers?
It depends on the narrator, and you might want, if that's important to you, you might want, because it's not included in their services, right? Like when they quote you their narration fee, they're not guaranteeing they're going to market for you. And so you might like to go look at their social media feed and see if it looks like they're pretty much advertising every book, and that might be a bonus to you. That's important to you. I also wanted to say that while I agree with everything Karen is saying about how to select your narrator and that your narrator is a marketing decision, as a counterpoint, I do want to say, because I also agree that we know that listeners will have a favorite narrator and then go listen to a new author because that narrator is narrating. As a counterpoint, I also want to say we don't have the exact data that proves that like the extra expense you're spending on the, celebrity narrator is definitely returned to you. So it seems logical, but at the same time, I wouldn't just assume that you need someone famous, especially because there might be a correlation, like because these narrators tend to be more expensive. Typically, the authors who have plenty of money and have like their own ebook following already are hiring them. So how much of, those books are getting listened to a lot is actually because the author had that platform in the first place. So I agree with everything Karen's saying. And I'm saying just be aware and have your eyes open that we don't actually have the data proving that you're going to make a better financial return that way. But also it is logical. So, make your own decisions around that.
And I think what Sarah's talking about is not like movie star celebrities we're talking
Correct,
about. We're talking about narrator celebrities, which exist, especially in romance. There are male and female, but often more male narrators that people are like, he's an auto buy for me, and people get very excited about. But I also agree that there's a point, I think, where that spending is not going to come back to you unless, like you said, you are already selling 50 grand a month of ebooks. But I think there's a middle ground where you can find someone who has the experience, has somewhat of a following, but maybe not everyone knows about them yet. and maybe they're not oversaturated, because that's another problem of casting, or trying to work with someone who's super popular.
And I think if you're hiring a producer, that might be the advice that you can rely on the producer to give you too, right? You don't have to know those things and figure them out for yourself.
Exactly right.
Right.
The producer will take care of it for you. Do we want to talk a little bit about, because so far we framed the context of like, here's why you'd want to sell your rights, but if you know you're going to make money, you probably want to hire a producer, and your time is probably better spent doing that. But a counterpoint is, Liv has never, Brywood, who is an author, I work with and I give talks with, she has never hired a producer, because for her, managing audio was very easy, because from her perspective, she's like, look, I found the right narrator. I only needed one narrator in my book. I found the right narrator. They were reliable and awesome. And after I spent the initial time to find them, I basically did nothing from then on and just had them do all my books. And so I do want to say, as a counterpoint, that like, if you are somewhere where in the middle where you're like, I do like to save a buck when I can, especially if you're in a situation where you're writing a series that would lend itself well to only needing to hire one narrator, because the more narrators you need on the book, the more complex it gets. Then, if you might want to go that route and manage audio yourself and invest that time in finding that awesome person you can rely on. And then from then on, just kind of the boat will row smoothly. And so I'm wondering if we want to talk a little bit about that for people who might be listening and they're like, look, I want to keep my royalties, but I'd like to save a buck if I can.
Well, I guess the main thing is, is that basically saying that what you hire a producer to do is not necessarily always a fixed set of things. So if you already know your narrator, then that's something they don't have to do. And would that adjust the price? And because we already talked about it, it's not just about somebody who can read the book. There's more to producing your audiobook than finding a narrator, right? So even though you might have the narrator already lined up, that doesn't mean you're done with creating your audiobook. So I would think that you'd still want to have a producer to handle some of that stuff, or something. I'm not sure, right?
I think what Sarah is talking about is, if you found the right narrator, and we can talk, this might be a whole other episode on how to find the right narrator, but many narrators these days can provide a finished product for you. They act as their own producer, and often many narrators will do this. You could just go to their website and contact them and ask them if that's something they do. Then you will pay them for subcontracting the editing and proofing. And I think that is, if you are right in third person from one perspective, that's when you really only need one narrator. For instance, cozy mysteries are a great example of this, where we're revisiting the same woman or man or whatever, cat, over and over again, solving different mysteries, but it's all in the same town. There's a lot of, the same characters coming back. Readers expect that you will have the same narrator, and they actually get quite upset if you switch to someone else, because that narrator has created that whole oral world. They know who all those characters are, and they're the same from book to book. Oftentimes narrators love that, because I know you're going to write 2 books a year, and I'll have those 2 books on my schedule for however long you write books. So it's worth it for them to act as producer, like Sarah said, once you've done all that work to figure out who to cast. That's one of the big jobs, when especially when there's only one narrator. If there's more than one, then there's other things. And the situation where you'd use more than one is often when you write in first person from different characters' perspectives. These days, listeners expect that those perspectives will be performed by different actors.
Yes, and that is always the industry standard and what listeners expect. And Lucy Lennox, who is a very popular, successful indie author, has elected to hire one person to do all of her first-person narration. She writes male romance, and she has this one narrator do it all. But this particular narrator is very, very versatile and brings the characters to life, and so her listeners are happy. And so it's just it's something you can do as an indie author if you're trying to save yourself cost and limitation and complication. But you need to be very careful and be aware you're not doing the industry standard.
You are doing the industry standard.
No, I mean, if you hire one narrator to do multiple
gotcha.
first-person points of view within the book, then you wouldn't be. Yeah.
And I think as indie authors, most of us know that when you buck the industry standard, often there are consequences.
Exactly. Okay. Well, you know, I think we're probably at the hour now, even though normally we were going to aim for a little less, but that's great because we had a lot to talk about. And I think there's still probably a lot more that we can talk about. And maybe narration is the subject of a completely future episode that we can dig into, right? I think the goal on this one was certainly to give authors sort of a perspective of the whole thing, the whole problem of audiobooks in general, and what they need to think about, what they need to do, all the considerations that they need to make. And I hope that we've sort of gone through all of that and sort of given people that kind of a background that they need to make an informed decision.
The thing we did not, besides the various ways you can choose or cast your narrator, and also some things about working with the narrator and what you want to have ready before you start the process. We didn't talk about marketing. And so I would like to say that, again, on my website under resources, I've got a little checklist of things that you can, specific to audiobooks, that you want to have ready before you release that audiobook. But I also offer audiobook review and promo tours and do consults. So feel free to contact me if you have questions about that.
Well, actually, I was going to wrap things up.
Diagram thing is where that comes in that, and I learned in publishing my own books, is that there are, again, readers with the eyes and readers with the ears, and sometimes they meet and sometimes they don't. So you want to figure out how to reach the people that don't already know about you, who are listeners in your genre, that will be new readers for you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was going to say before we wrap up, I'd love to find out from both of you sort of where we can find out more. The stuff you've said has been amazing. And I think, Craig, you probably agree that we could go on for another 3 hours talking about this. So I'm sure we would love to have you guys back. I, as an author who hasn't jumped into audiobooks yet, I found this completely fascinating. So, I mean,
good.
So we'll start off, Karen, since you did it. Like, if people have liked what you've got to say and would like to find out more, where can they go and find out more?
If you just go to Karen White, like the color, WHITE, audiobooks.com, that is my way. And then the tab resources is where you can find specifics on how to produce in audio.
That's great. And Sarah, same question to you. You've said some incredibly wise things today. If people like what they hear and they want to find out a bit more about the services you offer, where can they do that?
At sarahbethgoer.com. So Sarah with an H, Beth like the name Beth, Goer, GOER.com. And I have a tab on my website called Authors and Indie Pubs. And if you click that, I actually have a little 10-step overview to the audiobook process. And I've been on Karen's sites. Her resources are great. So now you have 2 tabs you can go click to look for great free resources to help you out.
That is brilliant. Well, thank you so much. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Hidden Gems is a company that, well, Craig, I'll go and you can say a little bit more about Hidden Gems, but some of the services we offer include consultation on advertising, help writing blurbs, help designing covers, helping things get to the next level in your self-publishing career.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we're always trying to connect with authors, help them, improve on themselves and work with them and help them get the word out about what they're doing, which is part of the reason why we started this podcast, right? So that we can give out that information and sort of feature the authors and the people that support the authors in everything that they're doing. So thank you both for spending the time with us today. And you're right, we're going to have a lot more to talk about. So we'll hopefully have you guys back on. And you're right, Karen, marketing was something that was on our list that I didn't even get to. So we absolutely have lots more to talk about this subject.
It was a
Thank you. So wherever you listen,
I was just going to say it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
You guys were
Yes,
amazing.
me too. Sorry.
So wherever you heard this, whether you heard it on YouTube, click the subscribe button and the bell notification, all that stuff. If you heard it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, do the same. And all of the links that we've mentioned during this are going to be down below in the description for this. So don't be shy about checking those up. And thank you very much. We will sign off now, but Fully Booked will be back very soon. And hopefully it won't be long before we have Sarah and Karen back with us again too.